The phone rang at 5 in the morning, and Elena Voss felt her stomach drop before she even looked at the screen. No one called Dominic Marchetti at that hour, unless something had gone terribly wrong. She had worked for him for 12 years, and in all that time, she could count on one hand the number of calls that came before sunrise. Each one had changed something. Each one had cost someone their freedom, their business, or worse. But this call was different. This time, she was the one making it. She stood in a narrow hallway lined with gray cinder blocks, gripping a phone attached to the wall by a thick metal cord. Her wrist still carried the faint red marks from the handcuffs that had been removed only an hour earlier. Behind her, a guard waited, arms folded, watching the clock. She had exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes to say something that would either save her life or end it completely. Her fingers trembled as she pressed the last digit. The line clicked, and then came the low, familiar voice on the other end, thick with sleep and irritation. "Whoever this is, you better have a good reason for calling me right now." Elena closed her eyes. "Dominic," she whispered, "it's me." There was a pause, a long, heavy pause that told her everything she needed to know. He recognized her voice immediately, but the shock of hearing it from this number, at this hour, silenced him for a moment. "Elena?" His voice sharpened, fully awake now. "Where are you? What's going on?" She glanced at the guard, then lowered her voice even further. "Listen to me carefully. I don't have much time. To understand why this call mattered so much, you have to go back to where it all began, months before that morning, in an office on the top floor of a building that looked like nothing more than an ordinary insurance company from the outside. Dominic Marchetti was a man who had built something out of nothing. He came from a family with little money and fewer opportunities, and by the time he was 30, he controlled an organization that stretched across 3 states. Restaurants, shipping companies, real estate offices, all of them appeared legitimate on paper, and most of them were. But beneath the surface, there was another layer, one that only a small circle of people understood. Dominic was careful. He was not the kind of boss who shouted or threw his weight around in public. He preferred quiet control, the kind that came from knowing exactly where every dollar went, and exactly who could be trusted. He surrounded himself with people who had earned their place, and he rewarded loyalty the way other men rewarded hard work. Elena had come into his life almost by accident. She had been hired as a temporary assistant for what was supposed to be a 2-week job, filling in for someone on leave. She was sharp, organized, and unusually calm under pressure. When the 2 weeks ended, Dominic asked her to stay. She agreed, thinking it would be a stepping stone to something else. 12 years later, she was still there. She became more than an assistant. She managed his calendar, yes, but she also managed the flow of information that kept his world running. She knew which calls to put through immediately, and which ones could wait. She knew which visitors needed coffee and small talk before business could begin, and which ones needed to be shown in without delay. She kept records that no one else was allowed to touch. Dominic trusted her with details that he shared with almost no one else, not because she asked for that trust, but because she had proven, day after day, that she deserved it. She never gossiped. She never made mistakes that mattered. She never asked questions she wasn't supposed to ask, or so he believed. The truth was more complicated. Over the years, Elena had begun to notice things, small inconsistencies in the numbers, meetings that were scheduled and then erased from the calendar as if they had never happened, envelopes that arrived and left without ever being opened in front of her. She was smart enough to understand what these things meant, even if no one ever said it directly. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself that as long as she did her job well, she didn't need to understand everything that happened around her. It was easier that way, safer, she thought. For years, that approach worked. She built a life around the edges of Dominic's world, without ever stepping fully into its center. She had her own apartment, her own small circle of friends who knew nothing about her employer's real business, her own quiet evenings that had nothing to do with the tension of the office. But quiet lives built on the edge of dangerous worlds rarely stay quiet forever. It started with a folder. An ordinary manila folder, left on her desk by mistake one afternoon when Dominic's longtime associate, a man named Victor Calder, rushed out of a meeting without gathering his papers properly. Elena picked it up, intending to return it to him, and in doing so, she saw a single page that made her stop breathing for a moment. Numbers. Rows and rows of numbers that didn't match anything she had ever recorded. Accounts she didn't recognize. Transfers that seemed to move money in circles, disappearing and reappearing under different names. She closed the folder quickly and set it aside, telling herself she had imagined the significance of what she saw. But that night, lying awake in her apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The numbers didn't just look unusual, they looked like evidence of something being hidden, not from the outside world, but from Dominic himself. She almost said something the next day. She almost walked into his office and asked him directly what the folder meant, but something held her back, a quiet instinct that told her this was not information to share carelessly, not until she understood more. So she waited. She watched. And slowly, over the following weeks, she began to notice a pattern. Victor Calder had been with Dominic almost as long as Elena had. He was well liked, respected by the other men in the organization, always quick with a joke or a kind word. He had a way of making people feel comfortable around him, which was probably why no one questioned the amount of responsibility he had been given over the years. But responsibility, Elena had learned, could be used two different ways. It could be honored, or it could be exploited. She began cross-referencing the numbers she had seen in that folder with the records she kept for Dominic's legitimate businesses. It took time, done carefully in small moments between her regular duties, never on the office computer, always on a small notebook she kept locked in her bag. What she found troubled her more each time she looked. Money that should have gone toward expanding one of the shipping routes was instead disappearing into an account tied to a company that didn't seem to exist beyond a name and an address. Small amounts at first, easy to overlook, but growing steadily larger over the months. She thought about warning Dominic dozens of times. Each time, she stopped herself, unsure of how to explain what she had found, without revealing that she had been going through papers that weren't meant for her eyes. She worried that if she was wrong, she could destroy a friendship that had taken years to build, one that mattered more to her than she liked to admit. And if she was right, she worried about something far more serious. She worried about what would happen to the person responsible once Dominic found out. The world Elena lived on the edge of was not one that forgave betrayal easily. She had seen enough over the years to understand what happened to people who crossed lines within the organization, even if she had never witnessed anything herself. It was understood, unspoken but absolute, that certain mistakes could not simply be corrected. They had to be answered for. She didn't want that weight on her conscience. She didn't want to be the reason someone's life changed forever, even someone who might have earned it through his own choices. So she kept gathering information quietly, telling herself she would find the right moment, the right way to bring it to Dominic that wouldn't feel like an accusation thrown carelessly into the room. She never got the chance. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, as she left the office later than usual after finishing a report Dominic needed for a morning meeting, two men approached her in the parking garage. They wore plain suits, nothing flashy, nothing that stood out. For a moment, she thought they might be new associates she hadn't met yet, people connected to one of the legitimate businesses. Then one of them held up a badge, and the other reached for her arm. "Elena Voss," the taller one said, his voice calm, almost gentle, as if he had done this 100 times before. "We need you to come with us." She felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. "What is this about?" "We'll explain everything at the station," he replied. "It would be easier for everyone if you came quietly." She thought about running. The thought lasted only a fraction of a second before reason took over. Running would only make things worse, and besides, she told herself, she had done nothing wrong. She had simply worked hard, kept records, answered phones, and tried her best not to ask too many questions about a business that wasn't fully hers to question. But as they placed the cuffs around her wrists and led her toward an unmarked car, she understood, with a cold and sinking certainty, that her carefully built wall between herself and Dominic's hidden world had just come crashing down. Whatever they wanted from her, whatever they believed she knew, it was about to change everything. And somewhere across the city, unaware that his most trusted employee had just been taken into custody, Dominic Marchetti slept peacefully, with no idea that in a matter of hours, his entire world would be shaken by a single phone call he would never forget. The room they took her to had no windows, only a single table bolted to the floor, and two chairs facing each other beneath a buzzing fluorescent light. Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying to steady her breathing, trying to look calmer than she felt. The taller detective who had approached her in the parking garage introduced himself as Daniel Pierce. His partner, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, gave her name as Grace Bennett. They sat across from Elena, a thick folder placed between them on the table, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Do you know why you're here?" Pierce finally asked. "No," Elena said honestly. "I don't." Grace Bennett opened the folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It showed the front of the insurance building where Elena worked, the same building she had walked into and out of thousands of times over the years. "You've worked for Dominic Marchetti for 12 years, Bennett said. It wasn't a question. Elena's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm his assistant. I organize his schedule and handle correspondence. That's all." "That's all," Pierce repeated, a faint smile crossing his lips, the kind of smile that carried no warmth. "You've been sitting in the middle of one of the largest organized operations on the East Coast for over a decade, and you want us to believe you just answered phones. I answer phones. I file paperwork. I don't ask questions about things that aren't my business." Bennett leaned forward. "That's the problem, Miss Voss. Everything about that office has become our business. We've spent the last 3 years building a case, gathering financial records, tracing money through accounts that shouldn't exist, and your name keeps appearing, over and over again, connected to transactions we believe you helped process." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "I process payroll, invoices, things any assistant would handle. If money moved through accounts I don't know about, that's not something I controlled." "Maybe," Pierce said, leaning back in his chair. "Or maybe you know exactly where the bodies are buried, so to speak, and you've been protecting a man who would do the same for you in a heartbeat. Except people like Dominic Marchetti don't protect anyone but themselves when things fall apart. You understand that, don't you?" Elena said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the safest response, but sitting in that room, under those lights, silence felt like its own kind of confession. They spent nearly 2 hours going over documents she had signed, meetings she had scheduled, phone calls that had passed through her desk. Some of it she remembered clearly, much of it blurred together after so many years of routine. She answered honestly where she could, careful never to speculate about things she genuinely didn't know, and equally careful never to offer more detail than was asked of her. At one point, Bennett placed a new photograph on the table. It showed Victor Calder, standing outside a restaurant Elena didn't recognize, shaking hands with a man she had never seen before. "Do you know this man?" Bennett asked, tapping the unfamiliar figure in the photo. Elena studied it carefully. "No, I've never seen him. His name is Simon Ashford. He's connected to a financial firm we believe has been used to move money out of the country. Victor Calder has met with him at least 6 times over the past year. Did you know about these meetings?" Elena's mind raced back to the strange folder she had seen months earlier, the numbers that hadn't matched, the account she couldn't trace. She thought of Victor's easy smile, the way he always seemed so at ease, so trusted by everyone around him. "No," she said carefully. "I didn't schedule those meetings. If Victor met with someone outside the office, it wasn't through my calendar." Bennett studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she believed her. "You understand what happens next, don't you? We have enough evidence to charge you as an accessory, Miss Voss. 12 years of employment records connect you directly to this operation. A jury will look at that and see someone who either knew everything or willfully avoided knowing anything, and either way, the law doesn't look kindly on either option." "I told you the truth," Elena said, her voice firmer now. "I don't know what you think I did, but I never handled anything illegal. I never moved money I wasn't authorized to move. I never lied on a document I signed." "Then help us," Pierce said, his tone shifting, softer now, almost persuasive. "Give us something real. Names, dates, anything that connects the money we've traced to the people actually responsible. Cooperate, and we can talk about reducing whatever charges come your way. Stay silent, and you'll go down with everyone else when this finally collapses. And believe me, it will collapse." Elena thought about Dominic, asleep in his home across the city, unaware that his organization was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than he realized. She thought about the folder she had found, the numbers that didn't add up, the quiet suspicion she had carried alone for months because she hadn't known how to share it without risking everything. She realized, sitting in that cold room, that the detectives believed Victor Calder's actions were somehow connected to Dominic, perhaps even directed by him. But everything she had uncovered pointed to the opposite conclusion. Victor had been moving money quietly, secretly, in ways that suggested he was hiding his activities from Dominic just as much as from the authorities. If that was true, then Dominic wasn't the mastermind these detectives believed him to be. He was, in some ways, a target himself, someone being deceived by a man he trusted completely. "I want a lawyer," Elena said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not answering anything else without one." Pierce sighed, closing the folder in front of him. "That's your right. But understand, Miss Voss, the moment you ask for a lawyer, this becomes a much longer process. You'll be processed and held while we finish reviewing the evidence." They left her alone in the room for what felt like hours, though she had no way of tracking the actual time. When they finally returned, they informed her that she was being formally charged, and that she would spend the night in a holding cell while her case was reviewed by the district attorney's office. The holding cell was small, with gray walls and a single metal bench. Elena sat with her knees pulled toward her chest, replaying the last several hours over and over in her mind. She thought about the folder she had seen, about Victor's calm smile, about all the small warning signs she had noticed and dismissed because acknowledging them felt too dangerous. She thought about loyalty and what it truly meant. She had stayed silent to protect Dominic, or so she had told herself, but really, she had stayed silent to protect the comfortable, quiet life she had built for herself. And now that silence had led her here, sitting in a cell, facing charges for a crime she hadn't committed, while the person actually responsible walked free, likely unaware that anyone suspected him at all. Sitting alone in that cell, Elena let her mind drift back further than the folder she had found months earlier. She remembered a night nearly 2 years before, when Victor Calder had stayed late at the office, long after everyone else had gone home. She had returned that evening to retrieve a jacket she had forgotten, and found him standing by the copy machine, feeding pages through it one at a time, his expression tense in a way she had never seen before. He had smiled quickly when he noticed her, covering his surprise with the easy charm he always carried. "Burning the midnight oil," he had said, gathering the papers before she could see what was printed on them. "You know how it is. Numbers never sleep." At the time, she had thought nothing of it. Late nights were common in their line of work, and Victor had always been dedicated, sometimes staying long after Dominic himself had gone home. But now, replaying the memory with new eyes, she wondered what exactly he had been printing that night, and why he had been so quick to hide it from her. There had been other moments too, small ones she had brushed aside without much thought. A phone call he had once taken in a stairwell instead of his office, his voice dropping the moment he noticed her walking past. A meeting on his calendar labeled only with initials, never a full name, unusual for a man who was normally meticulous about details. A period of about 3 months, roughly a year earlier, when he had taken several unplanned trips out of state, always returning with a story about visiting an old friend or handling a minor property issue. Stories that had never fully added up when she thought about them later. None of it had seemed significant on its own, but taken together, especially now that she understood the scale of what investigators believed had been happening, the pattern felt undeniable. Victor Calder had built a second life running quietly alongside his role in Dominic's organization, one that Dominic himself likely knew nothing about. She thought about Dominic's trust in Victor, a trust built over almost as many years as her own relationship with him. Victor had been there during difficult times, had helped grow the organization from something small into something far more powerful, had earned a level of respect among the other men that few others could claim. If Elena's suspicions were correct, Victor hadn't just been dishonest. He had been using that hard-earned trust as a shield, hiding activities dangerous enough to draw the attention of federal investigators, activities that could bring the entire organization crashing down around people who had no idea what was happening beneath the surface. She thought about her own choices too, the months she had spent quietly gathering information without saying a word to anyone. She could have gone to Dominic the moment she found that folder. She could have raised her concerns carefully, without accusation, simply asking questions that might have led him to investigate further on his own. Instead, she had waited, telling herself she needed more proof, more certainty, when really she had been afraid of what such proof might mean, afraid of disrupting a working relationship that had given her stability for over a decade. Now that fear seemed almost foolish. She was sitting in a jail cell, facing serious charges, while the true source of the danger remained free, likely unaware that anyone had noticed his activities at all. Her silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only delayed a reckoning that was clearly going to happen regardless of what she did or didn't say. A guard passed by her cell twice during those long hours, checking on the small number of detainees being held overnight. Elena watched the clock on the wall outside her cell move with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching longer than the last. She thought about her sister Claire, who lived 2 states away, and had no idea what was happening tonight. She thought about the small apartment she had built for herself, the quiet evenings she had valued so much, all of it now feeling impossibly distant. Mostly, though, she thought about the choice in front of her. When her one phone call finally came, she would have only a few minutes to decide how to use it. A lawyer could help her navigate the legal process ahead, could perhaps begin building a defense based on the fact that she had never knowingly participated in anything illegal. That was the sensible choice, the choice any reasonable person in her position would make. But sensible choices hadn't stopped Victor Calder from doing whatever he had been doing for the better part of 2 years. Sensible choices hadn't protected the organization from the kind of internal betrayal that could destroy everything Dominic had built, along with the livelihoods of dozens of people who depended on it, many of whom had nothing to do with anything illegal, people who simply worked in the legitimate restaurants and shipping offices that formed the visible half of Dominic's world. If she called a lawyer first, hours could pass before anyone thought to warn Dominic about what investigators believed, about Victor's secret meetings, about the danger closing in from a direction he wasn't watching. Every hour she waited was an hour Victor could use to cover his tracks further, to destroy evidence, to prepare an explanation that might convince Dominic nothing was wrong at all. She thought about the kind of man Dominic was underneath the reputation that surrounded him. In 12 years, she had never once seen him treat her with anything less than respect. He remembered small details about her life, asked about her sister during difficult times, had once quietly covered a medical expense for her without ever mentioning it directly, learning of the situation only through an insurance form that crossed his desk. He was not a gentle man in every sense of the word, and she understood the darker realities that existed alongside the version of him she knew. But he had never been anything but fair to her, and in a world that often rewarded neither loyalty nor honesty, that fairness had meant something. She owed him the truth, regardless of what it might cost her. Somewhere around 4 a.m, a guard approached her cell and informed her that she was entitled to one phone call before she would be transferred for formal booking. Elena stood slowly, her body stiff from sitting for so long, and followed him down a narrow hallway toward a phone bolted to the wall. She had thought, at first, that she would call a lawyer, someone who could help her navigate the charges against her. She had thought about calling her sister, the only family she had left, just to hear a familiar voice during the hardest night of her life. But as she stood in front of that phone, staring at the numbers, she understood with sudden clarity what she needed to do. If Victor Calder had been hiding something from Dominic, something dangerous enough to draw federal attention, then Dominic needed to know immediately, before Victor had the chance to cover his tracks any further, before more damage could be done to the businesses and the people Dominic had spent his entire life protecting. She thought about the risk. Calling him directly, from a jail phone line that was almost certainly being monitored, could expose things neither of them wanted exposed. It could make her situation worse. It could make his situation worse. But staying silent had already cost her everything she thought she was protecting. She picked up the phone and dialed the only private number Dominic had ever trusted her with, a number reserved only for true emergencies. As it began to ring, she glanced at the guard checking his watch nearby, aware that she had only a few minutes before she would be pulled away again. The line connected. She heard him answer, his voice groggy and confused, unaware that on the other end of the call, everything was about to change. Dominic Marchetti sat up in bed the moment he heard Elena's voice, his hand instinctively reaching for the lamp on his nightstand. The room filled with soft light, and beside him, his wife stirred briefly, before settling back into sleep, unaware that anything unusual was happening. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and walked toward the window, phone pressed tightly against his ear, his voice low but urgent. "Elena, what's going on? Why are you calling from this number? Where are you?" "I'm at the county holding facility," she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to sound calm. I was arrested last night. I only have a few minutes. Dominic's grip tightened around the phone. In all the years he had known her, Elena Voss had never once been in trouble with the law, never so much as received a parking ticket that he was aware of. The idea of her sitting in a holding cell felt almost impossible to process. Arrested for what? He asked, though even as the words left his mouth, a cold understanding began to settle over him. Federal investigators had been circling his operation for months. He had known this day might come eventually, had prepared contingencies for exactly this kind of situation. He simply hadn't expected it to touch Elena, the one person he had always considered separate from the more dangerous corners of his world. "They think I've been helping move money," she said. "They have records connecting me to accounts I've never seen before, transactions I never authorized." "Dominic, listen to me carefully, because I don't have much time and this is important." "I'm listening." She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice steadied, becoming clearer and more deliberate, as if she had rehearsed these exact words during the long hours of the night. "Do you remember the fishing trip 2 summers ago, up at the lake house, the one where Victor caught nothing all weekend and kept joking about needing better luck?" Dominic frowned, momentarily confused by the sudden shift in topic. "Elena, this isn't the time for—" "Please," she said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Just trust me. Do you remember?" He paused, understanding beginning to dawn that she was choosing her words carefully, aware that the call was almost certainly being recorded, aware that anything spoken too plainly could be used against both of them. "I remember," he said slowly. "Victor said something that weekend," Elena continued. "He said luck wasn't about the water you fished in. It was about knowing which pond nobody else was watching. I always thought that was just something he said to make himself feel better about an empty cooler. But I don't think it was, Dominic. I think he's been fishing in a pond nobody else has been watching, for a long time now." Dominic's blood ran cold as the meaning behind her words settled into place. She wasn't talking about fishing. She was talking about money, about accounts, about activities happening outside his awareness, activities connected somehow to Victor Calder, a man who had stood beside him for nearly 2 decades, a man he trusted as much as he trusted anyone in his life. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice tight with restrained urgency. "I found things months ago that I didn't understand at the time," she said. "A folder that wasn't mine to see. Numbers that didn't match anything in our regular records. I should have told you sooner, but I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to accuse someone without being certain. Tonight, the people questioning me showed me a photograph. Victor, meeting with a man named Simon Ashford, someone connected to moving money out of the country. They said it's happened at least 6 times over the past year." Dominic closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against his temple as pieces began falling into place, pieces he hadn't wanted to acknowledge even as small warning signs had occasionally crossed his awareness over recent months. Victor's occasional unexplained absences, a hesitation he had noticed once or twice in meetings, quickly covered by that easy, practiced charm. A comment from another associate, mentioned in passing and dismissed at the time, about Victor asking unusual questions regarding certain shipment routes that had nothing to do with his usual responsibilities. "Why are you telling me this instead of protecting yourself?" Dominic asked quietly. "You're the one sitting in a cell right now, Elena. You could use this call for a lawyer. You could use it for anything that actually helps your situation." Her voice softened, carrying something that sounded almost like relief, now that she had finally said what she needed to say. "Because I've spent 12 years watching you build something real, something that provided for a lot of people who depend on it, whether they know the full truth of where it comes from or not. If Victor has been doing what I think he's been doing, it's not just dangerous for you. It's dangerous for everyone connected to this organization, including people who have nothing to do with any of it. I couldn't sit here knowing that and say nothing, not when I finally had the chance to warn you." Dominic stood in silence for a long moment, staring out the window at the dark, quiet street below his home. Somewhere out there, Victor Calder was likely sleeping peacefully, confident in the trust he had spent years carefully cultivating, unaware that the woman he had once handed a misplaced folder to had pieced together enough to understand exactly what he had been hiding. "I'll find out the truth," Dominic said finally, his voice hardening with quiet resolve. "And Elena, whatever happens with your case, you have my word. I won't forget this. I won't forget what you just did." "There's one more thing," she said quickly, her voice tightening as the guard behind her stepped closer, gesturing toward his watch. The account. The company name attached to it was something like Ashford Meridian Holdings. That's what was on the documents I saw. I don't know if that helps, but it's all I remember clearly. It helps, Dominic said. It helps more than you know. I have to go, she whispered. They're taking the phone. Elena. The line went dead before he could finish whatever he had intended to say. Dominic stood frozen for a moment, phone still pressed against his ear, listening to nothing but silence and the faint hum of the dial tone. He lowered the phone slowly and turned to look at his wife, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm that had just begun to form around their lives. He didn't wake her. Instead, he dressed quickly and quietly, moving through the familiar motions of his morning routine, with a mind that was anything but calm. By the time he stepped outside into the cool early morning air, the sky had begun to lighten slightly at the edges, the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. He climbed into his car and sat for a moment, before starting the engine, replaying Elena's words over and over in his mind. 12 years. Victor Calder had been by his side for 12 years, through difficult negotiations, through disagreements with other organizations that could have easily turned violent had cooler heads not prevailed, through the slow, careful expansion of businesses that now provided steady income for dozens of families. Dominic had trusted him with details he shared with almost no one else, had considered him not just a business partner but something closer to family. The betrayal, if it was true, cut deeper than simple financial theft. It struck at the foundation of everything Dominic believed about the people closest to him, about the loyalty he had spent his entire career building and rewarding. He picked up his phone again, this time dialing a different number, one belonging to a man he trusted almost as much as he had once trusted Victor, a longtime associate named Peter Langford, who handled the more delicate aspects of internal security within the organization. Peter answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but immediately alert once he recognized the number calling him. "Boss? It's early. Everything all right?" "No," Dominic said flatly. "Nothing is all right. I need you to pull every record you can find, connecting Victor Calder to a company called Ashford Meridian Holdings. Quietly. I don't want anyone else knowing we're looking into this yet. Not until I understand exactly what we're dealing with." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of Peter sitting up, fully awake now. "Victor, are you sure about this?" "I'm sure of nothing yet," Dominic said. "That's exactly why I need you to find out. And Peter, one more thing." "Yeah? Elena Voss was arrested last night. I need you to find out everything you can about her case, and I need you to make sure she has proper legal representation by this afternoon. The best we can arrange, no matter the cost." Another pause, this one carrying a hint of surprise. "Elena? I didn't hear anything about that." "Neither did I, until about 10 minutes ago," Dominic said grimly. "Just take care of it, Peter. Both things. Quietly and quickly." He ended the call and sat in the driver's seat for several long minutes, watching the sky continue to brighten, watching the ordinary world outside his window carry on as though nothing had changed, as though an entire structure he had spent his life building wasn't suddenly balanced on the edge of collapse. Somewhere in this city, Victor Calder was likely still asleep, unaware that a 5-minute phone call from a jail cell had just set into motion a chain of events that would soon reach directly into his carefully hidden second life. And somewhere in a holding cell, Elena Voss sat quietly, exhausted but strangely calm, having finally released the weight she had carried alone for far too long, uncertain of what would happen to her now, but certain, at least, that she had done the right thing when it mattered most. He thought back to the day he had first met Victor, nearly 20 years earlier, at a small diner on the edge of town that no longer existed. Victor had been younger then, hungrier, full of ideas about how to grow the modest operation Dominic had inherited from an uncle who had never had much ambition beyond keeping the lights on. It was Victor who had suggested expanding into shipping, Victor who had spent long nights working through logistics that eventually became one of the most profitable branches of the entire organization. Over the years, Victor had earned a reputation among the other men as someone fiercely loyal, someone who would never dream of stepping out of line. He attended every family gathering Dominic hosted, remembered birthdays, sent flowers when Dominic's mother had passed away 3 years earlier, stood beside him at the funeral with a steady hand on his shoulder. It was the kind of loyalty that made betrayal, if that was truly what this was, feel almost impossible to accept. And yet, the more Dominic turned the pieces over in his mind, the more they seemed to fit together into a picture he didn't want to see, but could no longer ignore. He remembered a conversation from perhaps 8 months earlier, when Victor had pushed unusually hard for Dominic to expand a particular shipping route through a smaller port that had never made much financial sense compared to their existing options. At the time, Dominic had trusted Victor's judgment without much question, approving the expansion because Victor had always been right about these things before. Now he wondered whether that route had ever truly been about shipping goods at all. He thought about the quiet moments too, the ones that meant little individually, but gathered new weight in hindsight. Victor excusing himself from a family dinner to take a call he described only as urgent business, his tone clipped in a way that felt out of character for a man usually so relaxed. A new watch Victor had begun wearing sometime in the past year, an expensive one, the kind that raised no questions on its own but seemed unusual for someone whose salary, however generous, wouldn't easily account for such a purchase. None of it was proof. Dominic understood that clearly. Suspicion built from scattered memories, and a single coded warning from a frightened woman in a jail cell, was not the same as certainty, but it was enough to demand a closer look, enough to justify the kind of quiet, careful investigation that Peter Langford specialized in, the sort that wouldn't alert Victor, or anyone else, until Dominic understood exactly what he was dealing with. As he drove through streets still mostly empty at this early hour, Dominic found himself thinking about Elena again, about the courage it must have taken for her to use her single phone call not to protect herself, but to protect a network of people who had never fully let her into their world. Not completely. Not in the way they had let Victor in. She had spent 12 years on the outer edge of something she clearly understood, far better than anyone realized, choosing silence again and again, because speaking up felt too dangerous, too disruptive to the fragile balance she had built for herself. And yet, when it truly mattered, when the cost to herself was highest, she had chosen honesty over self-preservation. Dominic understood, perhaps more clearly than he had ever understood anything else in his career, exactly what kind of debt that created, and exactly what it would mean to fail to repay it. He also understood something else, something that settled over him with quiet, uncomfortable clarity as the first full light of morning broke across the city skyline. If Victor Calder truly had been running a secret operation for the better part of 2 years, moving money through hidden accounts, meeting with outside contacts under the cover of business trips and family visits, then Elena wasn't the only person who had been unfairly caught in the crossfire. There were likely others, employees, associates, perhaps even people entirely unconnected to any illegal activity who worked in the legitimate businesses that formed the visible surface of the organization, all of them now standing on ground that could shift beneath them at any moment because of choices made without their knowledge or consent. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him as heavily as the betrayal itself. He had built this organization, believing he understood every corner of it, every risk, every vulnerability. Discovering that a blind spot had existed for years, hidden by someone he trusted completely, forced him to question just how much else he might not fully know, how many other quiet arrangements might exist beneath the surface of a world he had always believed he controlled entirely. Dominic finally started the car and pulled out of the driveway, his mind already working through every possible angle, every person who might know more than they had let on, every step he would need to take to uncover the full truth before Victor had any chance to realize his secret had been discovered. The sun continued rising over the city, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold, indifferent to the quiet war that had just begun beneath its light. Peter Langford worked through the morning, with a focus that bordered on obsessive, pulling records from every source available to him, without drawing attention to what he was actually searching for. He had learned long ago that the most valuable skill in his line of work wasn't intimidation or force, though he was more than capable of both when necessary. It was patience, the ability to quietly gather information piece by piece until a complete picture formed, one that couldn't be argued against or explained away. By early afternoon, he had found what he needed. Ashford Meridian Holdings existed on paper as a small investment firm registered in a state known for its relaxed disclosure requirements. The listed owner was a man named Simon Ashford, but a closer look at the filing history revealed something more interesting. The company had been registered using an address that matched, almost exactly, a property Victor Calder had purchased under a different name, nearly 3 years earlier. A property Dominic had always understood to be a simple rental investment, nothing more. Peter cross-referenced banking records that had come into the organization's possession through contacts developed over years of careful relationship building, records that showed a pattern of transfers moving from several of the organization's shipping accounts into Ashford Meridian Holdings, then out again into accounts overseas that were far more difficult to trace. The amounts, individually, were never large enough to draw immediate attention. Small percentages skimmed carefully from larger transactions, the kind of theft designed specifically to remain invisible unless someone knew precisely where to look. By Peter's estimate, working through the numbers as thoroughly as the limited time allowed, Victor had moved somewhere close to $2 million over the past 2 years. Money quietly redirected from routes and deals that Victor himself had often been the one to suggest and oversee. Peter called Dominic just after 2 in the afternoon, his voice carrying the particular flatness he used whenever delivering news he knew would be difficult to hear. "It's real," he said simply. "Everything Elena told you checks out, and honestly, it's worse than what she described. He's been at this for a long time, boss. Long enough that this wasn't some moment of weakness. This was planned." Dominic sat in his office, the same office where Elena had spent countless hours managing the details of his world, and felt something harden inside him that he hadn't fully expected. Anger, certainly, but beneath it, something closer to grief. The particular ache of losing someone he had genuinely considered a brother, even if that person had never truly existed the way Dominic believed. "Where is he now?" Dominic asked. "At the restaurant on 5th Street, meeting with 2 of the younger associates about next month's supply contracts. Should be there another hour, maybe less." "Good," Dominic said. "I want you to arrange a meeting for this evening. Tell him it's about the contracts. Tell him whatever you need to tell him, but I want him in my office at 7 o'clock, and I want it to look completely ordinary." "And Elena?" Peter asked. "I found a lawyer, one of the best in the state for cases like this. She's been briefed. Should be meeting with Elena within the hour. Given what you've told me, and given what we're uncovering about Victor, there's a real chance we can show Elena had no knowledge of these hidden accounts at all, that everything traces back to Victor operating independently. It won't happen overnight, but it's a strong foundation." "Do whatever it takes," Dominic said. "Cost isn't a concern." He spent the remaining hours before the scheduled meeting reviewing every document Peter had gathered, building a complete understanding of exactly how Victor had constructed his hidden operation. The more he read, the more he recognized a chilling level of care in how it had all been designed, each transaction structured to avoid drawing attention, each cover story crafted carefully enough to survive casual questioning. It was, in its own dark way, impressive work, the kind of careful planning Dominic himself had always valued in the people around him. That was perhaps the cruelest part of the discovery. Victor hadn't stumbled into this through carelessness or desperation. He had built it deliberately, using every skill Dominic had helped him develop over 2 decades, turning that same skill directly against the organization that had given him everything he had. At exactly 7 o'clock, Victor Calder walked into Dominic's office wearing his usual relaxed smile, carrying a folder of contract details that had nothing to do with the true purpose of the meeting. "Peter said you wanted to go over the supply numbers," he said, settling into the chair across from Dominic's desk, the same chair he had occupied countless times over the years, for meetings both routine and significant. "Close the door," Dominic said quietly. Something in his tone must have registered, because Victor's easy expression flickered, just slightly, before he reached back and closed the door behind him. "Everything all right?" "Elena was arrested last night," Dominic said, watching Victor's face carefully as he spoke. "Federal investigators questioning her about money moving through accounts connected to a company called Ashford Meridian Holdings." Victor's expression remained carefully composed, but Dominic had spent 20 years learning to read the small signals that most people missed, the slight tension around the eyes, the fractional pause before responding that suggested a mind working quickly to construct an appropriate response. "That's terrible," Victor said. "Is she all right? Do we know what they're accusing her of exactly?" "I think you know exactly what they're accusing her of," Dominic said, his voice remaining level despite the anger building steadily beneath the surface. "Because I think you know exactly what Ashford Meridian Holdings actually is, Prav." The silence that followed stretched long enough to answer the question more clearly than any words could have. Victor's shoulders shifted slightly, the practiced ease draining slowly from his posture, as he seemed to understand, finally, that this conversation was not going to follow any script he might have prepared for less serious accusations. "Dominic," he began carefully, "whatever you think you know, I can explain." $2 million, Dominic interrupted. "Over 2 years. Moved out of routes you personally suggested, through a property registered under a name that traces directly back to you. I have the records, Victor. I have all of them. So before you decide how you want to explain this, understand that I already know the truth. What I want to hear from you now is why." Victor sat in silence for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, the easy charm that had defined him for 2 decades had entirely disappeared, replaced by something quieter, almost tired, as if a weight he had carried alone for a long time was finally being set down. "It started small," he said. "A mistake in a shipment years ago that would have cost us badly if it came to light. I covered it quietly, moved some money around to make the numbers work without anyone noticing. It wasn't supposed to become anything more than that. But it did," Dominic said. "Once I understood how easy it was to move money, without anyone questioning it, I told myself I deserved more than what I was earning. After everything I had built for this organization, I told myself it wouldn't hurt anyone, that the amounts were small enough compared to everything we brought in that nobody would ever notice." Victor's voice grew quieter. "I never meant for it to reach 2 million. It just kept growing, a little more each time, until I wasn't sure how to stop even if I wanted to." Dominic studied the man sitting across from him, someone he had once considered as close as family, someone who had stood beside him through difficulties that had tested them both in ways few outsiders would ever understand. "Elena is facing serious charges because of what you did," Dominic said. "Charges that could take years of her life, for something she had no part in beyond simply working in the same building where you chose to hide your secret." Victor's face paled visibly. "I never intended for anyone else to be pulled into this." "Intentions don't matter now," Dominic said. "Only consequences do." He let the silence stretch again, allowing Victor to sit with the full weight of what he had done, before continuing in a voice that had grown perfectly steady, perfectly controlled. "Here is what happens next. You will provide Peter with complete access to every account, every document, everything necessary to fully unwind what you've built, so we can begin repairing the damage before it spreads any further. You will cooperate fully and completely, without hesitation, without holding anything back." "And in exchange?" Victor asked quietly. "In exchange, I will consider, carefully, what happens to you after that," Dominic said. "But understand this clearly. Your place in this organization, the trust you spent 20 years building, ends tonight. Whatever happens next depends entirely on how honestly and completely you help repair what your choices have broken." Victor nodded slowly, the fight visibly draining out of him, replaced by a resigned understanding that the life he had carefully balanced between loyalty and betrayal had finally, irreversibly, come crashing down around him. Peter Langford entered the office a short while later, once Dominic had opened the door and given a small, deliberate signal that had been agreed upon earlier that afternoon. He said nothing about what he might have overheard, if anything, standing quietly near the doorway with the patient discipline of a man who had spent years handling situations too delicate for casual conversation. "Take him through everything tonight," Dominic said, nodding toward Victor, who sat with his hands folded in his lap, looking smaller somehow than he had appeared just an hour earlier. "Every account, every contact, every piece of the operation he built. I want it fully documented before morning." "Understood," Peter said. Victor rose slowly from his chair, pausing for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, some final explanation or apology that might soften what had just happened between them. But whatever words he might have considered seemed to dissolve before reaching his lips, and instead he simply nodded once toward Dominic, before following Peter out of the office, leaving Dominic alone with the quiet hum of the building settling around him for the night. He sat for a long while after they left, staring at the closed door, turning over the events of the day in his mind. 20 years of partnership had ended in less than 30 minutes, reduced to a confession spoken in a tired, defeated voice. Somewhere in that exchange, Dominic realized, he had expected to feel a sharper anger, something closer to the fury he might have shown a stranger who had attempted to steal from him. Instead, what settled over him felt heavier and more complicated, closer to mourning than rage, the particular grief that comes from losing someone you once trusted completely, even while understanding that person had never fully existed the way you believed. He thought about the other men within the organization who would need to be told, carefully and deliberately, once the details had been fully sorted out. Some would be angered on Dominic's behalf, protective of an organization they had helped build over years of hard work. Others might be frightened, wondering if similar scrutiny could eventually fall upon their own activities, however honest those activities might be. Managing that reaction, ensuring loyalty remained steady even as trust in one of their own had been irreparably broken, would require careful handling in the days ahead. But that concern could wait until morning. Tonight, there was something more immediate weighing on his mind, a debt that needed to be addressed without delay. He picked up his phone and called the lawyer Peter had arranged, a sharp, experienced woman named Nora Whitfield who had built a reputation for handling complicated financial cases with quiet precision. She answered on the first ring, her voice brisk but professional. "Mr. Marchetti," she said, "I've just come from meeting with Miss Voss. She's holding up well, considering the circumstances, though understandably exhausted." "What's the situation?" Dominic asked. "The charges against her are serious on paper, but from what she's described, and from what your associate has already shared with me regarding the true source of these financial irregularities, I believe we have a strong path toward getting them substantially reduced, possibly dismissed entirely, depending on how quickly and clearly we can demonstrate that she had no direct knowledge or involvement in the accounts under investigation." "Do whatever you need to do," Dominic said. "Whatever resources you require, they're available to you without question." "I appreciate that," Whitfield said. "I should also mention, given what you've shared about Mr. Calder's cooperation, if he's willing to provide a formal statement clarifying Miss Voss's lack of involvement, that alone could significantly accelerate the process. Prosecutors tend to move much faster when the actual architect of a scheme is willing to clearly identify who was and wasn't involved." Dominic considered this for a moment. "I'll make sure that happens," he said. "Whatever Victor's fate ends up being within this organization, he owes Elena that much at minimum, and he'll provide it." "I'll be in touch as soon as there's meaningful movement," Whitfield said. "In the meantime, she asked me to pass along a message, if that's all right." "Go ahead. She said to tell you that she's sorry she didn't come to you sooner, when she first noticed something was wrong. She said she should have trusted you with it immediately instead of waiting." Dominic closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the entire day settle more fully across his shoulders. "Tell her there's nothing to apologize for," he said quietly. "Tell her I understand exactly why she waited, and that what she finally chose to do took more courage than most people I've known in my life." After ending the call, Dominic remained in his office, long after the rest of the building had gone dark and silent around him. He thought about the strange, unexpected symmetry of the day, how a single early morning phone call from a jail cell had unraveled a betrayal he might never have discovered otherwise, at least not until far greater damage had already been done. He thought, too, about what he owed Elena beyond simply funding her legal defense. 12 years of quiet, careful loyalty deserved more than a debt repaid and then forgotten. It deserved recognition, a permanent acknowledgement of what she had risked, and what she had ultimately chosen, when the easier path would have been silence, self-protection, looking out only for herself, in the most difficult moment of her professional life. He made a decision, sitting alone in that quiet office as the first hints of exhaustion finally began settling over him, after a day that had started before dawn, and stretched long into the night. Whatever happened next, whatever shape his organization took once this crisis had fully passed, Elena Voss would never again stand on the outer edge of his trust, forced to guess and wonder, and carry suspicions alone, out of fear of overstepping some invisible boundary. She had proven, in the most difficult way possible, exactly where her loyalty truly stood. That was not a debt he intended to leave unpaid. Outside, the city moved on unaware, evening settling gently over streets filled with people living lives entirely disconnected from the quiet reckoning taking place behind the closed door of a single office, where 2 decades of trust had just been permanently and completely rewritten. 3 weeks passed before Elena Voss walked out of the county courthouse, a free woman, the charges against her formally dismissed after prosecutors reviewed a mountain of evidence demonstrating she had no knowledge of, or involvement in, the hidden accounts that had drawn federal attention in the first place. Victor Calder's detailed statement, delivered exactly as Dominic had promised, had proven decisive, clearly separating Elena's routine administrative work from the carefully concealed scheme he had built and operated entirely on his own. The weeks leading up to that moment had not been easy. Elena had spent several additional days in custody before the lawyer, Nora Whitfield, successfully argued for her release on her own recognizance while the investigation continued. Those days had tested her in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, long hours spent uncertain about her future, wondering whether the call she made that early morning had truly made a difference or simply cost her more than she could afford to lose. But slowly, steadily, the pieces had come together, exactly as Whitfield had predicted. Financial records painted an increasingly clear picture of Victor's isolated operation. Investigators, once they understood the actual scope and structure of what had been happening, shifted their focus almost entirely away from Elena, recognizing that the evidence simply didn't support the theory that she had been a willing participant in anything illegal. Standing outside the courthouse on a bright, clear afternoon, Elena breathed in air that felt different somehow than it had just weeks earlier. Lighter, cleaner, though she understood rationally that nothing about the physical world around her had actually changed. It was she who had changed, shaped permanently by the events of that long, sleepless night and everything that had followed. She noticed Peter Langford waiting near a car parked along the curb, his expression carrying the same calm, professional composure she had come to recognize over the past several weeks, as he had checked in periodically on her behalf, always at Dominic's direction, always ensuring she had everything she needed as her case moved through the system. "He wants to see you," Peter said simply, opening the car door for her. "If you're willing." Elena nodded, settling into the passenger seat, watching the familiar streets pass by, as Peter drove toward the same building where she had spent 12 years of her life, the same office where everything had once felt so routine and predictable before a single misplaced folder had changed the course of everything that followed. Dominic was waiting for her in his office when she arrived, standing rather than seated behind his desk, something in his posture suggesting he had been waiting somewhat anxiously for her arrival despite his usual composed demeanor. When she stepped through the doorway, he crossed the room and, for the first time in 12 years of professional distance, embraced her briefly, a gesture that carried more meaning than any words might have managed. "I don't know how to properly thank you," he said, stepping back, studying her face carefully, as if reassuring himself she was truly all right. "What you did, calling me, instead of protecting yourself, I understand exactly what that cost you, and what it could have cost you if things had gone differently." "I almost didn't," Elena admitted, settling into the familiar chair across from his desk, a chair she had occupied countless times over the years, for far less consequential conversations. "I stood there with that phone in my hand, and every instinct told me to call a lawyer instead, to think only about myself for once. But I kept thinking about everyone who depends on this organization, people who have nothing to do with what Victor was doing, people who would have been hurt if things had continued unchecked." "You saved more than you realize," Dominic said quietly. "Not just the organization itself, though that matters. You saved dozens of families who depend on legitimate income from businesses that would have collapsed entirely if federal investigators had continued building their case around the assumption that the corruption ran through the entire operation, rather than being isolated to one person acting alone." Elena considered this for a moment. "What happened to Victor?" she asked, a question she had wanted to ask for weeks but hadn't found the right moment to raise. Dominic's expression grew more serious. "He's no longer part of this organization, in any capacity. He returned everything he could account for, cooperated fully with unwinding the accounts he had created, and provided the statement that ultimately helped clear your name. Beyond that, his future is his own responsibility now, separate entirely from anything connected to us." "Do you think he'll face legal consequences?" Elena asked. "That remains uncertain," Dominic admitted. "The investigation into his activities continues independently now, separate from the charges that were dropped against you. Whatever happens to him legally will happen through the proper channels, and honestly, given what he did, given the risk he created for you and for everyone connected to this organization, I find it difficult to feel much sympathy for whatever consequences eventually find him." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of the past several weeks settling between them in a way that felt different now, less burdened by uncertainty. though not entirely free of the lingering shadows the entire ordeal had cast across both their lives. "I want to offer you something," Dominic said finally, breaking the silence. "Not as compensation, because nothing could truly compensate for what you risked, but as recognition of exactly how much I value what you've built here, and what you proved about your character when it mattered most." Elena waited, curious despite herself. "I want you to take on a larger role within the organization," Dominic continued, "not simply managing my schedule and correspondence, but overseeing internal operations more broadly, ensuring the kind of careful, consistent oversight that might have caught what Victor was doing far earlier, before it grew into something as damaging as it eventually became. You've proven you have both the judgment and the integrity for that kind of responsibility, more clearly than almost anyone else I've worked with over the years." Elena felt something shift inside her, a mixture of surprise and quiet pride she hadn't expected to feel after everything that had happened. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't need to decide immediately," Dominic said. "Take some time. You've earned that much, certainly, after everything these past few weeks have put you through." She left his office that afternoon carrying a weight that felt different than the one she had carried for months before her arrest, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, shaped by an experience that had tested and ultimately clarified exactly where her loyalties and her courage truly stood when everything was on the line. Over the following weeks, Elena took time to process everything that had happened, spending quiet evenings reflecting on the choices that had led her to that early morning phone call, the months of silent suspicion that had preceded it, and the strange, unexpected outcome that had followed. She visited her sister, Claire, for a long weekend, finally sharing details about her work that she had always carefully avoided discussing before, finding a kind of relief in no longer needing to maintain quite so many careful boundaries around the truth of her professional life. She thought often about the moment she had picked up that phone, uncertain and afraid, weighing a decision that could have gone in countless different directions. She thought about how easily she might have chosen differently, might have protected herself first, and allowed Victor's betrayal to continue unchecked, potentially growing into something far more damaging before anyone discovered the truth. She understood now, more clearly than she ever had before, that loyalty built on silence and avoidance was fragile, easily shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. True loyalty, the kind that mattered when everything was truly at stake, required honesty, even when honesty carried real risk, even when speaking up meant potentially losing everything you had carefully built. Eventually, Elena returned to the office, accepting the expanded role Dominic had offered her, stepping into a position that carried more responsibility and more direct involvement in the organization's inner workings than she had ever held before. It felt different, walking through those familiar hallways now, no longer standing quietly at the edge of a world she had spent years observing from a careful distance, but fully present within it, trusted completely, her judgment valued in ways it had never been before. Victor Calder's name rarely came up after those first difficult weeks, mentioned occasionally in passing, but never dwelt upon for long. Whatever consequences eventually found him, legal or otherwise, existed separate from the world Elena and Dominic continued building together, a world that had been tested severely and had ultimately emerged stronger for having survived that test. On a quiet evening several months later, Elena stood by the window of her new office, watching the city lights begin to flicker on as darkness settled gently over the streets below. She thought about how much had changed since that terrifying early morning phone call, how a single decision made in a moment of fear and uncertainty had reshaped not only her own life, but the entire foundation of trust within an organization that continued to provide stability for so many families who depended on it. She thought about courage and what it truly meant. Not the absence of fear, she had come to understand, but the willingness to act rightly despite it, to choose honesty and loyalty, even when silence would have been safer, even when the outcome remained entirely uncertain. Somewhere across the city, Dominic Marchetti sat in his own office, reviewing reports that reflected an organization now more carefully monitored, more transparently managed than it had ever been before, thanks in large part to the woman he now trusted more completely than he had trusted almost anyone else in his life. A few weeks after Elena accepted her new position, news reached the office that federal prosecutors had moved forward with formal charges against Victor Calder, built almost entirely on the financial records Peter Langford had uncovered, and the detailed statement Victor himself had provided as part of the agreement that helped clear Elena's name. Dominic shared the news with her plainly, without satisfaction or celebration, simply as information she deserved to know given everything she had endured. "How do you feel about it?" Dominic asked, watching her reaction carefully as she absorbed the news. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "I don't feel triumphant, if that's what you're asking," she said. "Mostly I just feel tired, thinking about how much simpler everything might have been if he had simply come to you directly, years ago, with whatever grievance drove him toward this in the first place, instead of building something so damaging behind closed doors. People rarely choose the simple path when they've convinced themselves they deserve more than they're owed," Dominic said quietly. "It's a lesson I should have recognized sooner, watching him more closely, instead of assuming loyalty was permanent, simply because it had lasted so long." "You couldn't have known," Elena said. "None of us could have, not until the pieces were finally laid out clearly enough to see." They didn't dwell on Victor's situation much longer after that conversation, both of them understanding that his fate now belonged to a legal process, entirely separate from the world they continued building together. Whatever consequences he faced, they existed as the natural result of choices he alone had made, choices that had nothing to do with anyone else's decisions or actions. Life within the organization gradually settled into a new rhythm over the following months, one built on more careful oversight and clearer communication than had existed before. Elena approached her expanded responsibilities with the same quiet diligence she had always brought to her work, though now she carried herself with a confidence that hadn't been quite as visible before, the natural result of having proven, in the most difficult circumstances imaginable, exactly what she was capable of when everything was at stake. She began meeting regularly with the various managers overseeing the organization's legitimate businesses, developing relationships and channels of communication that hadn't existed as clearly before, ensuring that small inconsistencies, the kind that had once grown unnoticed into something far more damaging, would be caught and addressed quickly going forward. It was careful, unglamorous work, but work that mattered enormously, work that Elena found she genuinely valued, knowing it helped protect not just Dominic's interests, but the livelihoods of everyone connected to the organization, in ways both visible and hidden. One afternoon, several months after the courthouse steps and that awkward, meaningful embrace in Dominic's office, Elena found herself reflecting on how much distance she had traveled from the woman who had once deliberately avoided asking too many questions, who had convinced herself that willful blindness was somehow safer than honest engagement with the world around her. She understood now that safety built on avoidance was never truly safety at all, only a temporary illusion that inevitably collapsed under enough pressure. Real security, she had come to believe, came from honesty, from trust earned through difficult choices rather than convenient silence, from being willing to risk everything when the moment demanded it, rather than protecting oneself at the expense of what truly mattered. Her sister Claire visited again during the autumn, and the two of them spent a quiet evening together, sitting on the small balcony of Elena's apartment, watching the sky shift through shades of orange and purple as evening settled over the city. "You seem different," Claire observed at one point, studying her sister with the particular attentiveness only a close sibling could offer. "Not worse, just different, more sure of yourself, maybe." Elena smiled slightly, considering how to explain everything that had changed, without revealing details that still needed to remain private. "I think I finally stopped trying to stand at the edge of my own life," she said. "For years, I told myself that staying quiet, staying separate from anything difficult, was the safest way to live. I've learned that's not really living at all, just waiting quietly for something to eventually force the issue anyway." Claire reached over and squeezed her sister's hand gently, understanding perhaps more than she let on, sensing that whatever Elena had gone through had reshaped something fundamental in how she approached her life, even if the full details remained unspoken between them. As winter approached and the first cold mornings began settling over the city, Elena found herself, on occasion, thinking back to that early morning phone call, the cold cinder block hallway, the trembling in her hands as she dialed a number she had never expected to use under such circumstances. It remained, even months later, the most frightening and consequential moment of her life, a single decision, that had tested everything she believed about herself, and ultimately revealed a strength she hadn't fully known she possessed. Neither of them spoke often about that early morning phone call anymore, the memory settling quietly into the past as their working relationship continued forward, strengthened rather than weakened by everything they had endured together. But both of them understood, in their own quiet way, that everything that followed, every measure of stability and trust that now defined their partnership, had begun with a single, courageous decision made in a cold holding cell at 5 o'clock in the morning, when Elena Voss chose to protect something larger than herself, and in doing so, changed the course of both their lives forever.